Today, 101 years ago, right, Omowale, Malcolm X, was born. He entered the earth. I'll talk a little about his story from the Pan-African and spiritual center, and then relate it to our current reparation struggle today. Me, to be quite honest, a lot of times I get frustrated at the way we tell the story about Malcolm X because we don't give the proper context. So let me do that. Let's go back 101 years ago today, May 19th, 1925. Malcolm Little is born to Louise and Earl Little in Omaha, Nebraska. But in order to understand that, you got to go back 6 years to 1919 and understand that regent and plenipotentiary, heir to the Ethiopian empire and throne, Rastafari, sends 4 Ethiopian ambassadors, including the mayor of Gondar, the head of the military. They come to the United States. It was the first time that African royalty and head of government made a state visit to the United States. The Ethiopian flag ceremoniously flew over the White House in 1919 Jim Crow. Now the mission goes to Washington, D.C., New York, and Chicago. Okay. At that same time, well, when the mission came to Chicago, Prophet Grover Redding and others in Chicago recognized that this was the fulfillment of some prophecies related to the return from captivity. And they started preaching about this, and they formed the first Rastafari organization called the Star Order of Ethiopia. At the same time, Marcus Garvey is sending a delegation to the Paris Peace Conference that was attended by 32 diplomatic delegations to settle the claims following the first European savage war, sometimes called World War I. Marcus Garvey is claiming that the former German must be given over to an African Black government administration under the UNIA. Earl Little, Malcolm X's father, is the president of the UNI chapter in either Detroit or East Lansing. And at this time, Regent and Plenipotentiary is inviting Black Americans through the UNIA to return to Ethiopia. So at that moment, we are at the Paris Peace Conference asserting our right to self-determination and preparing to repatriate to Africa under the guidance of Rastafari, who is regent and plenipotentiary, heir to the throne, who would later on become Haile Selassie. Malcolm X's father is a leader in this. He is charged with getting petitions signed to bring to the Paris Peace Conference. This means, from an African point of view, remember, from African ontology, our mentality, right? We are sovereign. And existence is not just existence here on earth, our physical existence, right? There's an ancestral realm that represents the past, those that lived in the past. They are alive and they are with us. And there is also the realm of the unborn, which represents the future. right? That is a reality. So from the African point of view, our traditional spirituality, the past, present, and future are one. And African jurisdiction extends to the past, present, and future. African jurisdictional and juridical sovereignty means that our jurisdiction, our reality existed first, and even though suppressed, is not extinguished. Malcolm X's father was sovereign activated, which means his son, Earl Little, was born as a sovereign activated person, retaining this ancestral memory and sovereignty. So Malcolm X, when we get to his later life, what he does by going to the heads of state of the African Union, attempting to bring our case before the World Court, preparing us for repatriation. A lot of people, they don't know that Malcolm X's political philosophy was, we're not staying in the United States, we're preparing to repatriate to Africa. Listen to what it says. Let me find the quote. I want to read it to you. I want to find the exact quote. This is Malcolm X speaking in a 1964 interview. The 22 million so-called Negroes should be separated completely from America and should be permitted to go back home to our African homeland, which is a long-range program. So the short-range program is that we must eat while we're still here. We must have a place to sleep. We have clothes to wear. We must have better jobs. We must have better education, so that although our long-range political philosophy is to migrate back to our African homeland, our short-range program must involve that which is necessary to enable us to live a better life while we are still here. Why would Malcolm say that? It's because his father was connected to Rastafari, to Emperor Haile Selassie, whose plan was to what? Repatriate Black Americans. Malcolm X was born into this. It's in his sovereign DNA, in his blood, and it was activated after his Detroit Red period. It's not a coincidence. See, we don't tell the story correctly. We don't talk about how Malcolm, when he goes to Africa, he lectures at Haile Selassie University, October 23rd, 1963. He meets Emperor Haile Selassie, calls him the world's greatest leader. A year later, he returns, submits a memorandum to the Organization of African Union, founded by Emperor Haile Selassie, and now consisting of 33 or 34 heads of state, tells the leaders of Africa, your problems are our problems and our problems are your problems. And if apartheid in South Africa is an international issue that must be brought before the World Court, then also racism against Afro-Americans in the United States, the apartheid practice in the Jim Crow United States, is also an international issue that must be brought before the World Court. All of this goes back to Malcolm X's father, Earl Little, and Marcus Garvey, and the sovereign activation in his blood. Malcolm X returns to Africa again in October 1964. He goes to Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Why? Because the Organization of African Unity set up an African Liberation Committee who was tasked with financing, coordinating, and providing diplomatic cover to the African liberation movement. And by this time, they had recognized the new African liberation movement that Malcolm X was leading in the United States. I'm not going to talk about Malcolm X's relationship with the Revolutionary Action Movement at this time. That was the underground armed guerrilla struggle movement in the United States. I've lectured on that before. I don't have time to get into that, but it's been documented, and we can talk about that later, right? But at that time, when Malcolm X went to Tanzania, 1964, they gave him instructions. He said, we can do for you what we're doing for the ANC. We can do for you what we're doing for ZANU-PF. We can do for you what we're doing for the PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau. We can do for you what we do for the other African liberation movements when you satisfy two requirements. First, you must form a united front. You must get Martin Luther King and his Christian followers, primarily in the South, with your Muslim followers, primarily in the North, and all the Afro-Americans into an organization that is their united front and can speak with one voice. And that is when Omowale, Malcolm X, and John Henrik Clarke, the great Pan-African historian, formed the Organization of Afro-American Unity to do just that. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King had a telephone conversation on February 15th, where they had laid out the basic agreement and how they were going to work together to form this united front. Malcolm X's house was then firebombed, and a week later, Malcolm X is assassinated. He had already got the support of 3 African nations to bring the case before the World Court. 2 of his key contacts were also assassinated within the 2 months that Malcolm X was assassinated. This is the part of the story that is not generally known or told, that Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie said, form that organization, and then you have to demonstrate your military capacity to carry out ground actions and second strikes, because we're not going to waste money and arms on a fake revolutionary movement that doesn't have the capacity to carry out military campaigns. Hence, the Revolutionary Action Movement, the Black Liberation Army, and the United States COINTEL response that this was the greatest threat to United States national security. And after that, right, they couldn't wage war against Black people overtly, so they fabricated what they would call the drug war. And then they said the drug war, we had to wage total war and fight drug war, which was a euphemism for going into new African communities, right? Criminalizing them, arresting them, re-enslaving them under the 13th Amendment and putting them into the prison system while assassinating their leaders. Malcolm said that the OAAU's purpose was to unite all Afro-Americans. That means all Black people in North America, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean under one organization that would then connect to the OAU. 2 governments. A government for the Afrodescendants in the diaspora to connect with one government, a United African States for the Africans on the continent. Malcolm X met with several African leaders about this plan. And then he met with one of the leaders of the Rastafari movement, Elder Mortimer Planno, and Mortimer Planno told Malcolm, he said, when your plan for a Black nation, right, fails, at that point, your only hope and your only solution will be repatriation. Emperor Haile Selassie then tasked both Mortimer Planno and Malcolm X to begin a repatriation census and collect the names of those people who wanted to repatriate to Africa. Malcolm X talks about this in a book where he talks about he had started collecting the names, and then somehow the person responsible for that lost the names. Again, Malcolm was assassinated, and that entire plan for organizing Afro-American people to repatriate under the leadership and guidance of Emperor Haile Selassie, right, who had since 1919 been preparing for this, was completely swept under the rug. And so the story that they talk about Malcolm X is a false narrative. They highlight the feud between Elijah Muhammad, his break from the Nation of Islam, to talk about black people against black people, right? They want to highlight that to make that as the most interesting story about Malcolm X. And not that he was following orders from the African High Command, from Emperor Haile Selassie, about how to wage our liberation struggle and preparing our people to return home. So finally, all of that is related to what's happening now with the reparations movement.